How is it changing Japan intrinsic to Europe's geopolitical aspirations and vice versa? Hello everyone. Let's discuss a less visited facet of Western cooperation in the context of the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. Japan is a close ally of the United States, we all know this, and it is protected by the US security umbrella. But Japan is also a core member of the Western sanction regime against Russia. The interesting bit is that not many people would know that Japan-Russia relations have been quite good despite their disputes on the Kuril Islands. Japan, being an island country, is locked in island disputes with three of its neighbors. So with China, it has a dispute over the Senkaku Islands. With South Korea, it has disputes over the Takeshima Islands. And with Russia, the dispute is over the Kuril Islands. Despite this, Russia-Japan relations have been doing pretty well. So Japan's Russia strategy actually works along three verticals. One is settling the Kuril Island dispute that I just told you about. Second is managing the rise of China. And most importantly, looking at Russia as a viable alternative for Japan's oil and gas imports, which are overwhelmingly dependent on the Middle East. So just like Europe was overwhelmingly dependent on Russia for their oil and gas, Japan, on the other hand, is overwhelmingly dependent on the Middle East. And post-Ukraine, I think the whole world knows that impressive trade is no guarantee for stability. Japan is a fairly interesting country. We know that it survived the atom bombs, and post its defeat in the Second World War, Japan was made to adopt a constitution that would permanently outlaw war as a means to settle disputes or further state policy. This has been the essence of Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which is treated as a core tenet of Japan's modern state. But critics have been pointing out for decades that the kind of territorial and existential threats that Japan faces from China, from North Korea, and in the case of defending itself, lest a conflict broke out, say in the Taiwan Straits, Japan better bolster its capabilities. There has been impressive progress on that front, especially under the famous Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who was unfortunately assassinated last year. So, operating beyond the constraints of Article 9 of its pacifist constitution, Japan has recently introduced, some structural defense reforms that have completely overhauled its security strategy. And like I mentioned earlier, against the backdrop of the conflict in Ukraine, it has been in news for supporting the Western sanctioned regime and forging deeper ties with European actors like the United Kingdom. Japan and UK signed a landmark defense agreement last week. And similarly with Italy, with France, with Germany, the European Union, and even the three Baltic countries, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. Now, as you know, that Japan is also a G7 member. As the war enters its second year, the G7 will be meeting in Hiroshima, which is a city in Japan, for its 2023 annual summit. So a significant part of this agenda will involve brainstorming perhaps more economic sanctions on Russia, tightening the loopholes of the existing sanctions regime in the light of this protracted war that has been wreaking havoc on the global economy, and perhaps discussing other economic challenges in the world today. And you know that we live in an age of polycrises or multiple crises, so all of that is going to be tackled by the G7. Sounds logical. But does that mean all is well within the Allies' universe? So under the above convergent trends resides an aberration in Japan's policies on Russian energy, which might lead to cracks within the Allies' unity if the war continues the way it is, and as a result, its costs keep rising for the world. I mentioned about Shinzo Abe and his impact on Japanese security and politics. You know, he is considered a mentor to the current Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. Let's discuss how Kishida has departed from his mentor's legacy, especially towards Russia. When Fumio Kishida became Japan's prime minister, it was expected that he would carry forward with the legacy of his mentor, the late PM Shinzo Abe. While that holds true in how Kishida has ensured that Japan postures itself with the pronounced military capabilities, I'm referring to the recent reforms, Kishida's real departure from the Abe era has actually been on the question of Russia. Like I mentioned, Abe's legacy rested on cooperation with Russia for energy, managing China, and resolving the long-standing island disputes, the Kuril Islands. Fumio Kishida, however, has rewritten his mentor Abe's rules of engagement with Moscow in his own indelible ink. Let me give you an example. So Kishida's decision to impose sanctions against Russian President Vladimir Putin himself has actually been considered a landmark political decision in Japan's history. Tokyo has also provided millions of dollars in humanitarian aid to Ukraine. However, there is one area where the Japanese leadership does hesitate to isolate Moscow, and that is on the sensitive question of key energy projects in the Russian region of Sakhalin. Russia plays a critical role in Japan's quest for energy security. Energy cooperation with Russia is the core tenet of Japan's long-term goal of energy security. So what Tokyo is trying to do is to diversify from its heavy dependence of crude oil from the Middle East, which account for, say, 90% of Japan's oil and about 20% of its gas. Learning from the perils of dependency in today's very uncertain world, Japan has been quick to identify actors that can plug those gaps, the dependency lessening gaps. Therefore, in an attempt to bolster its energy security, Japan has been looking at co-developing oil and gas facilities from Russia's Sakhalin in two projects, and these two projects are called Sakhalin 1 and Sakhalin 2. Now, Sakhalin makes sense because of geographical proximity that enables the shipments to arrive in about 3 days only, making them really cost-effective for Japan. Trade data for 2021 shows that Japan had already started importing about 3.5% of its crude oil and nearly 9% of its LNG, which is liquefied natural gas, from Russia. However, Kremlin's retaliatory sanctions have landed Japan in a vulnerable spot. I'll try and analyze this better. Sakhalin 2 was the first to suffer Putin's retaliation against Western sanctions. By the summer of 2022, that is last year, Putin had seized the project and evicted a major stakeholder, the British firm Shell, which held a 27.5% stake. He then moved the project under a new Russian company, forcing the existing stakeholders to buy new shares in the new company. That was Putin's revenge. As expected, Shell, the British company, exited the project soon. Sakhalin 2 is primarily an LNG project that supplies most of its gas to Japan. Therefore, Japanese firms like Mitsui and Mitsubishi, which own a combined 22.5% stake in the project, decided to stay on. And Russia's state-owned energy company Gazprom remains the largest stakeholder in Sakhalin 2. Putin's next onslaught, as expected, came a few months later, this time targeting the Sakhalin 1 oil and gas projects. So before the war, Japanese firms, together as a consortium under the name Sakhalin Oil and Gas Development Company, held about 30% stake in the project, which was formerly operated by the US-based company called ExxonMobil. India's ONGC Videsh Limited, the foreign arm of the Oil and Natural Gas Corporation, the ONGC, held about 20% share, and Russia's Rosneft held about 20% stakes. Those have been the other major shareholders. But after the war, and to retaliate against the sanctions put against Moscow, Putin passed a decree that unilaterally terminated Exxon's contract without any compensation to the American firm and established a new operator for Sakhalin-1 as well. Now, this abrupt change also authorized Kremlin to decide whether foreign stakeholders could retain their stakes in the project or not. As was in the case of Sakhalin-2, the Japanese consortium chose to remain with the new operator, this time joined by India's ONGC, while American Exxon left. So with American and British firms' respective withdrawals from these two projects, the risk of China stepping in to buy the stake runs pretty high. So with such mega stakes at China's disposal, Sakhalin-1 and 2 are indeed a complicated bet for the West, with their core ally, Japan, caught in the middle of counter-retaliatory measures. So, what makes this apprehension even more worrisome for the West is that Japan sought exemptions for the Sakhalin projects as the G7 introduced a price cap on the Russian oil, which came into effect from 5th December 2022, which is last year. Apparently, Tokyo is not really preparing to move away from Sakhalin. Clearly, they can't. According to reports, Chinese firms are in talks to buy Shell stakes in Sakhalin-2. As for India, there is little room to maneuver. As much as New Delhi would like to be wary of Beijing becoming a disproportionately high stakeholder in these critical, crucial energy projects, its priorities will be to straddle the divergences between the West and Russia and get the production running even at the cost of China joining. Now, if we consider what impact would these have on Europe and Japan relations, the situation is very interesting. So, while Europe is struggling to wriggle free of its energy dependence on Russia, Japan, its core ally, is doing the opposite. This is a cleavage among the G7 that Russia can exploit later. So far, Japan's foremost ally, the United States, has been mindful of Tokyo's energy security aspirations and has pretty much supported its decision to remain in the projects. But the protracted nature of the war will pave the way for Europe to cut down dependence on Russian gas and gain more elbow to impose yet another tranche of energy-related sanctions in 2023, which is this year. So this move could create pressure on Japan to rethink its Sakhalin policy. Therefore, the fault lines could be yet more vulnerable to deepening. So while the fate of Japanese firms does remain a tad uncertain as far as the energy projects are concerned, Japan is simultaneously deepening its relations with several European players in an attempt to compensate for its divergence on Sakhalin. And that Japan is doing by Kishida's indivisible security push for Europe. Now, on the surface, this could be a balancing act by Kishida. But if you look at it at a deeper level, Japan's pivot to Europe hinges on its reiteration of indivisible security for Europe and the Indo-Pacific region together. But what does it tell us about the nature of the East-West solidarity and its future? In what is referred to as the issue linkage strategy, Japan under PM Kishida has been furthering the Abe-era strategy of linking security challenges in Europe and in East Asia to make the Europeans act upon them. So this push is evident in the burgeoning defense cooperation with primary European actors. Let me give you an example. So Japan has recently inked an unprecedented defense pact with the UK. It has joined Italy and UK to develop the most advanced AI-enabled Tempest aircraft, which is touted to outdo America's F-35s. So Japan's joining has provided a global outreach and outlook to an essentially European aircraft program. Now, to give you a second example, while the world attention was on German Chancellor Olaf Scholz's controversial visit to China on I think in the first week of November 2022, Berlin simultaneously vowed to deepen and expand its range of cooperation with Tokyo in all key sectors as well. Likewise, Japan's defense cooperation with France has been deepening with robust convergence on the Indo-Pacific. And not only France, but all major European actors such as the UK, Germany, the EU, all of them have been focusing on the Indo-Pacific. Now, that makes operating on the idea of indivisible security gain traction among all these players. In this regard, if there is one Indo-Pacific player with the required economic heft and fast developing strategic capabilities as well to truly champion the merging of these two security theaters in Europe and Indo-Pacific, it definitely is Japan. And what makes the case of Japan even more credible and convincing is the delicate balancing on the question of Sakhalin, a key ponderable for India's strategic autonomy as well. So the world leaders are actually brainstorming over a lot of economic challenges right now at Davos at the World Economic Forum Summit. And very soon they'll be meeting yet again at the G7 annual summit, which is going to happen in Hiroshima. It'll be interesting to see how Japan straddles the twin challenge of retaining its stakes in Sakhalin as well as supporting the Western sanction regime against Russia. I'll be back soon again to discuss yet another pressing global concern. Until then, stay tuned.